Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to this webinar. This is a webinar in the series of the Ghent Workgroup, and this particular one will be about the survey that the Ghent Workgroup did earlier this year. And what we will do is look a little at what the results of that survey are, and then also put them in perspective with regards to previous surveys that we have done and some trends and so on that we see in there. To do a little bit of housekeeping, this should be a relatively short webinar. My goal is to take about half an hour of your time. I can see that there are lots of people online whose name I recognize, so welcome to all of you. Welcome also, of course, to all of the people who are new. Let me introduce myself shortly. My name is David van Driessche. I'm the Executive Director of the Ghent Workgroup, whose name I recognize, so welcome to all of you. Welcome also, of course, to all of the people who are new. Let me introduce myself shortly. My name is David van Driessche. I'm the Executive Director of the Ghent Workgroup, and I'm also Chief Technology Officer at 4Ps. If you wonder where that name comes from, it's a little bit complicated, but 4Ps is a distributor of software, specifically software for graphic arts. One of the vendors we cooperate with very closely is Callas Software, and Callas is a member of the Ghent Workgroup, hence why I am still tied to the Ghent Workgroup. For those of you who joined in an earlier webinar about PDF 2.0 and PDFX6, that was done by Dietrich van Zechern from Callas Software. If you missed any of the previous webinars, as I said before, they are recorded, so go to the Ghent Workgroup website and you will find all of them there. Okay, so time, I believe, to get started. And first thing is to introduce what we did. What we wanted to do from within the Ghent Workgroup was to hold a survey to people in graphic arts in general, regardless of whether they were more on the creative side or more on the production side. We wanted to make it as broad as possible, and hence we had it translated. You can see all the languages there. English was the main one, but then we had translations into Dutch, French, Spanish, Italian, German, and Czech. And what we can see in the numbers, and you'll see that a little bit later as well, is that this helped significantly in getting more answers. The survey was advertised by the Ghent Workgroup itself, but also by most of the members of the Ghent Workgroup. And if you're not that familiar with the Ghent Workgroup structure, the members are, on the one hand, vendors in the graphic arts space, like Callas Software that I mentioned before, but also Adobe and Quark and so on. Also, on the other hand, user associations in different countries. In Belgium, for example, we have Medibel Plus and Fibelgra. In Switzerland, I just picked two countries at random. We have PDFX Ready. Those member organizations also advertised the existence of the survey to their members in order to get more responses. The survey was held in April and May 2017, and as you can see, we had more than 1,000 answers in total, which is actually quite significant. It's a very high number for this type of survey. And the survey was pretty long. Some people didn't answer everything, but what we see is that much more than 1,000 people completely answered all questions in there. And that gives us a pretty nice group of respondents to draw conclusions from. So who are those people who answered? Well, on this slide, you have a distribution of people according to the country that they are from, and unsurprisingly, perhaps, the United States is the top country in there. That would be very difficult to have it otherwise. After all, there are more than 300 million Americans, which is nothing compared to most European or most European countries are nothing compared to that. Still, you can see some of the focus of the Ghent Workgroup also historically by looking at the numbers 2, 3, 4. Belgium and the Netherlands score very high, Germany scores very high, and that is of course because in those countries the Ghent Workgroup has a very long history and is very well represented by the user organizations there as well. You also see that the Czech Republic scores very high, and this is likely due to the fact that again there was a lot of advertising going on by some people in Czech Republic, but also the localization, the translation into Czech will almost certainly have played an important role in there. This slide is also important to keep in mind when we look at further slides. Of course, the results that we have received from Belgium and Germany and the Netherlands are much more statistically relevant than the results we received from Denmark or Australia, for example, because there are simply much fewer people who took part of this webinar in those countries. So these people, which company did they come from, or which type of company did they come from? Well, you can see that it is all over the map. If you think about graphic arts and who plays in graphic arts, then we have just about everyone. Of course, some people again or some types of companies are better represented. Commercial printers are, prepress, then ad agency, software and hardware vendors. This is more or less the traditional core group of people that we target. When you go through the list, you see a lot of people that come from the production side, and that's normal because that's the people who we most naturally, I would say, reach. We are very happy to see that there is a still relatively big ad agency, creative agency, also freelance designer group. This is really a very important group for the Ghent Workgroup, but traditionally it has been a group that is very hard for us to reach. And the fact that we make some inroads and also talking to those people is very, very important. Another way to look at this is to look at these companies who responded. What kind of company size are we talking about then? And this slide shows you what you probably would expect. If you look at the very bottom, it says commercial printer, and most of the people in that area, so in that type of company, are between 25 and 100 people. And that's about probably what you would expect from commercial printers. When you go to freelance designer, it's of course completely different. You will have a lot more smaller companies. Publishers are a little bit more towards the big companies with a pretty strong presence of 500 people plus companies in there. So this, again, this slide is here to give you a little bit more of an idea of which people did we reach and what demographics are they, what types of companies are they in. Now, where it becomes really interesting, of course, is when we start talking about graphic arts in specific and graphic arts topics. And then one of the first questions that you can ask is, which file types do you receive from your clients and which file types do you produce yourself? So, in other words, what's the input in your company and what's the output that you generate? And the trend that we have here, when we compare this with earlier surveys, and there was a pretty big survey done in '98, there was another pretty big survey done in 2008. So these have been done in roughly about 10-year stages. And when you compare those, the amount of PDF files that is coming into these companies has increased very significantly. So we see that most companies say that one of the file types that they receive a lot is PDF. Close to 90% of the people say that, and that's a really significant growth when compared to previous surveys. The amount of PDFX files that comes in has also increased a lot, and well, who lost in this in this row of file formats? That's mostly PostScript and EPS. So the amount of PostScript and EPS has gone down. Still, you can be a little bit surprised perhaps about the fact that more than 20% of the people say that PostScript is still a significant file format that they receive as input, and still about 15% of the people produce PostScript or EPS as their output format. Yeah? So we've moved a long way towards PDF, but it is, at least for me, still a little bit surprising that some of these other formats are still as important as they are. Let's talk about pre-flight quality control. And again, the first question is a very obvious one, is do you pre-flight? Here, again, the amount of people that say that they pre-flight has definitely gone up since previous surveys. And of course, being from the Ghent Workgroup, I consider that a very good thing. However, before we start being completely optimistic about this, this slide is important to qualify the previous one. So yes, 83% of people say that they pre-flight, but when we ask how that pre-flight is done, and keep in mind that people could answer multiple things here, then a lot of people still equate pre-flight with visual checking of the file. And most of them in something like Adobe Acrobat or Reader, but still a relative, well, it's luckily it's not that high, it's close to 5–6% of the people say that they also use Apple Preview or some free PDF viewer to well, pre-flight their files. Of course, there are dangers or risks associated with that, and we prefer that people pre-flight with different means. And luckily, those also score very well. You have Acrobat pre-flight, you have Callus PDF Toolbox, you have Infocus Pitstop, and then you have a number of other tools where they either build their own pre-flight or they have built in an engine from someone else. But in all of those other cases, you're looking at tools that can really pre-flight files and find things that cannot be found when you only do visual inspection, even if you do that visual inspection in Adobe Acrobat or Reader. So again, a positive trend. It would be a little bit better perhaps if people relied a little bit less on the visual inspection and they relied more on technology that can do in-depth pre-flight of files. And then another one that we always ask in all of these surveys is how many of the files that you get in contain errors. And here the well, the positivism, if you want, can be continued a little bit more. Still, these numbers definitely have improved since previous surveys as well. So there are some people, up to 5%, who say that most files contain errors, but the majority of the people say that there are very few files that contain errors when they come in. Be advised, we're talking about pre-flight errors here, not about warnings. So these files might still give warnings when they are pre-flighted, things that need to be checked out. But at least a lot of people say that the files that they get in are without errors, so things that should or probably will stop production. So that's not a bad result. And then we also always look at what are the pre-flight errors that you see, and nothing much has changed here. There are some items that have moved up or moved down, but the lists, if you look at which problems appear in this list and you would look 10 years ago or 20 years ago, then a lot of these things, of course, are the same. What is something that is noticeable, though, is that, for example, low resolution images scores really, really high is one of the big problems. And of course, it's also one of the problems that is impossible to fix. The only thing you can do is go back to the customer and say, we need a file with higher resolution images, or simply print the lower res image that was supplied by your client. The same in a way by no bleed. There is technology to create bleed, but in many cases you will have to go back to the customer. The same with fonts not embedded. Yes, you can embed fonts, but in most cases it's not a smart idea to do so. So a lot of these problems that score very high are also problems that are relatively difficult to fix. And really the only solution there is not technology to fix this during pre-flight, but would be better education on the side of who creates these files and supplies them, because they are the ones that can fix them before they are being sent. Second area that we asked some questions about is color. So we asked what people do with pre-flights, and we also asked what people do with color. And there was a very broad question to begin. The question is, do you use color management? And then a very high proportion of people says, yes, we use color management, 86%, which is very high. However, when you look at what do you do with ICC profiles and incoming files, that story again needs to be qualified a little bit perhaps. 19%, you see that, a very high amount of people, 19% says, I discard all ICC profiles in incoming files. Now, this may be a valid workflow decision. If you know that the files are coming from people who will not include the correct ICC profile, discarding them might be a valid thing to do. But still, it is strange to say that you have a color management workflow and then discard all ICC profiles, or as the second option says, only honor the output intent, and so don't care about any images that might have an attached ICC profile. And this is something that is a little bit concerning in that case, and something that perhaps we would need to, or we would want to find out a little bit more what people actually do in that particular case. What is a trend, and probably has always been this way and probably will continue to be this way, is if you look on the left-hand side, you have this large purple area with 34%. Those people replace whatever comes in with the standard ICC profiles they see in-house. And again, that probably points to low quality of the files that come in, at least in terms of color management, where whoever receives those files has made a determination that it's better to simply ignore what comes in and replace them with a standard ICC profile. So I think while this slide is very, very positive, it needs to be, again, qualified a little bit with the results of the next question. And then when we ask about standards, I mean, people who use color management workflows should normally use some kind of standard, at least that's what you would expect. About 10% says no, but then people also, of course, use the other things that you would expect, ranging from FOGRA, G7 swap crackle. A lot of people say FOGRA. This is probably because we have a little bit of a bias towards Europe, but, and this is important, when we go look at those results in more detail, then you see that FOGRA, for example, is also used in the US in a lot of cases. Now, what is important to realize again is that people could tick multiple boxes, and that's also possible. It could be that for some work that you get, you use FOGRA profiles. For other work, you do swap, for example, depending on the client that you work for or the type of file that you get in. So FOGRA has a pretty high percentage across the board, actually. Workflows, this is for us interesting to see what the landscape looks like, but most of the questions we ask in this corner are there in order for us to judge how modern the workflows from people are and what their capabilities are. It is very nice for us to work on, I'll give you a very good example, it's nice for us to work on specifications that are using PDFX4, but PDFX4 implies live transparency. If from such a survey we would learn that nobody has a native PDF RIP, then live transparency in files is not going to have a lot of advantages because they would need to be flattened anyway before they are given to a PostScript-based RIP, or the RIP would flatten them itself. So this is important for us to judge what direction should we go into and what are the capabilities of the output devices in the real world. So what are the limitations that we as the Gantt Workgroup have to live with? There's still a reasonably high number of people that say that they don't know or they're not sure what they have in their particular shop. There was also an option for not applicable. So someone who is on the creative side and doesn't work with a RIP could say, this question is not applicable for me. So these people on the first line, I'm not sure or I don't know, should be people that are in companies that have RIPs, like printers and so on, but that don't know exactly what the capabilities of that RIP are. What we see in comparison to previous surveys is that, and that's very logical and in line with what you would expect, the native PDF interpreters have, of course, increased quite significantly. There are still a high amount of people that say that they have a PostScript interpreter, but again, people could check multiple boxes, and I could definitely see that people would have a mix of more modern and then maybe more legacy devices in there. But the native PDF interpreters are definitely increasing, and that is nice because the latest specifications of the Gantt Workgroup are indeed built on PDFX4, and native PDF interpreter technology in a RIP is important to treat those files well. What prepress systems do you use? This is always a very incomplete list, and you can see that very well by looking at the other category at the top, where, well, this is actually the biggest category. So there are a lot of people that are not covered by any of the technologies that we have in here, and this for us is more as information if you want as well. And then we come to a section that is more interesting for us, and that is the section on standards. So, first question, what standards are you familiar with? And of course, this is an important one. The Gantt Workgroup advertises its own specifications, but we also spend a lot of time advertising PDFX and PDFX Plus specifications. That's part of all of the marketing that we do. In countries where the Gantt Workgroup specifications are perhaps not that well known, we would still expect PDFX to be rather well known. And that's also what we see. The percentage of people that say that they know what PDFX is very high. PDFX scores 89%, which is really high, and that's a very good result. What is also interesting is that the Gantt Workgroup itself scores pretty high. The Gantt Workgroup specifications score more than 50%, and that's definitely an improvement over previous surveys. It's a better result than what you would expect, because in many cases the Ghent Workgroup specifications are not marketed as Ghent Workgroup specifications, but they are marketed as specifications from a local organization. So someone in the Netherlands might go to Print Arena, which is the website they have that hosts information for graphic arts and specifications for graphic arts. They might go to Print Arena. Print Arena talks about the Ghent Workgroup, but I can very well imagine that people end up using downloads from that website without ever realizing that they are using something from a different organization. Same in Belgium with Medibel Press and Fibelgra, for example. So this is a pretty high result for the Ghent Workgroup, and we're very happy with that. PDFX Ready also scores pretty high, but again, sometimes the devil is in the detail, and we also looked at this information in a little bit of a different way. This is the same question as before, so which standards are you familiar with? But now what I'm doing here is I'm zooming in on that first bar that you see there. So those 89% of the people that know about PDFX and how that is distributed across the respondents. So are you familiar with the PDFX standard? And then when you look at that on a country-by-country basis, then you can see that the PDFX knowledge is pretty high across the board. Don't look too much at the lower end of the, well, actually, I can't say that in this case because they're random. I was looking at Australia. If you remember from the first slide, that we had very few people from Australia answering, so you probably shouldn't have attached too much importance to that result. But when you look at what do we have in here, Sweden, Germany, Austria, Belgium, United Kingdom, Spain, most of the European countries, actually, the core European countries score very high on this. The USA scores pretty high on this as well. When you look at the Ghent Workgroup, the situation is slightly different, and that's what we all would have expected. The Ghent Workgroup specifications are much better known in the countries where historically the Ghent Workgroup started and where we have user associations that very actively advertise knowledge about the workgroup. People who go and speak at events, people who do webinars for their company, all those kinds of initiatives. Where is the name Ghent Workgroup the best known? Well, Belgium, Netherlands, where is France, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, United Kingdom. That is where this started. And in the US, for example, PDFX is much better known than the Ghent Workgroup specs by itself are known. So no real surprises. This is why I started doing these slides. The question, are you familiar with the PDFX Ready standard? Well, that scores very high in Switzerland, as it should be, because this is really a Swiss organization who has developed this standard. It also scores very high in Germany and Austria, as I would expect. A lot of the communication about this is done in German, and these countries typically will consume that information a lot easier than some of the other countries in Europe. So you see the other European countries where that knowledge is a lot lower. However, you can also see that in the US and in the United Kingdom, the percentages are pretty high, and that is probably not because those people know PDFX Ready. It is probably because they know PDFX, and they assumed that PDFX Ready was some form of PDFX, so a PDFX substandard or related specification. So sometimes you have to be a little bit careful on how you interpret the data, but the main countries here, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, that is completely in line with the expectations. What is perhaps more important is which standards do you use? It's really cool to know about PDFX, but if you don't end up using it, then for the Gantt Workgroup, that's a little bit of a loss still. And when you look at which standards do you use, then again, PDFX scores very high, both PDFX 1A and PDFX 4, which is not surprising. What also scores high, of course, is my own settings, my printer standard settings, and in many cases, those are, of course, based or on an industry standard like PDFX or the Gantt Workgroup. So that's about what we would expect. Still, a lot of people also use the Gantt Workgroup specification, so that's very good as well. The Gantt Workgroup has existed for quite a long time, meanwhile, and one of the things that we have to do very regularly is ask ourselves what the next thing is that we are going to work on. Of course, one of the options would be that there is no next thing to work on because all of the problems have been solved. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, so far that's not the answer that we have been getting. And so one of the questions in this survey was, when you look at the standards out there, whether they are from ISO or they are from Ghent Workgroup or someone else, which standards do you think are missing? Where have we dropped the ball and what should we focus on? And it's very nice to see that the two highest scoring items in there are things that we are actively working on. Specifications for digital print. So far, the advice I've typically given to people is look at the sheet fed offset specification and then derive something from that if you are in a digital print workflow. But the Gantt Workgroup didn't really have a specification for that particular market segment / technology. And what we are working on at the moment is exactly that kind of specification. It is almost ready for prime time, and we expect that particular specification to come out in the near future. So it's good to see that there is a real need for that and that we have done some of that work already and that will become available in the near future. The same for large format print. While the technology in many cases is also digital, of course, it's still its own market segment. The workflows are typically a little bit more complex. The requirements for files are more complex, but perhaps the biggest thing that sets it apart from this digital print area by itself is that the products are so diverse. If you look at what people print in large format print, then it ranges from small banners to photo prints to what you need for the side of a bus or a tram, to the huge things that are canvases that are used to cover buildings that are being repaired. It's all over the board. And that makes it a challenge to develop specifications for it. Because of course, for each of those things, we have different requirements. What is good here is that the Ghent Workgroup has been working on this and actually has been working on this for a couple of years. And again, we are pretty close to having something that will be ready for, in this case, testing. This will be a little bit of a new specification for the Ghent Workgroup, and I don't want to go into too much detail because it would be outside of the scope of this presentation. But if you are interested in that market segment, I would advise you to either keep an eye on what the Ghent Workgroup is doing or to actively participate in what we are doing. You'll find contact information on the Ghent Workgroup website. So if you're interested, get in contact. We will welcome your insight and help. And then I think this is almost the last slide of what we're looking at here. Of course, an important one for us is, are you familiar with the work of the Ghent Workgroup? And this also was a rather satisfactory result and a much better result than what we've seen in some of the earlier surveys. A lot of people know us, follow us closely. Even more people say that they use the Ghent Workgroup specifications, which is actually what this is all about. So when they know the Ghent Workgroup specification or use the packaging specifications, then that is really good. A major piece of work that we do is the Ghent PDF Output Suite, which is a test suite for workflows and RIPs. Very easy to visually interpret whether a workflow or RIP has done the right thing. It tests a whole bunch of features across the PDF specification, things like overprint, support for fonts, transparency support, all of these things. So it's very nice to see that a lot of people use that specifically as well. And then, of course, you will always have people who are not aware with what we're doing or only in passing, and our educational outreach, if you want, or marketing outreach could always be better in that regard. So cutting to the really important thing is, how long have you been using the Ghent Workgroup specifications? And this again is a really good result. We have lots of people who say that they have been using the applications for 5 to 10 years, between 1 and 5 years, even a lot of people who say more than 10 years, which is very nice. So all in all, when you look at the people in this chart who are using those specifications, the answers are already very good. If you look at what people say in terms of, I'm not using them today, but we're looking at implementing them within the next year or within the next 3 years, then the results are completely good. And that's what I wanted to run through in terms of the results from that survey. If there are any questions, now would be a very good time to put them in that GoToWebinar control panel. I see that there is one in here already. Let me see what that is. Would you recommend to embed RGB images in PDFX Plus files? In your opinion, is printing industry widely able to process them? For most companies, that's at least a huge warning. Very good question. My answer will be mixed. And first of all, I think if you look at, first of all, when you look at the specifications that the Gantt Workgroup creates, then you find two versions of the specification that we promote at the moment. The first one is called 1v4, and those specifications are built on top of PDFX 1a. PDFX 1a, of course, implies no transparency and only CMYK and spot color, so no chance to have RGB images in there. Those 1v4 specifications are today still the most widely used specifications in the world. There are exceptions, but in most countries, you see that those are the specifications that are in use, and so the use of RGB images would simply not be possible if you follow those specifications. The second version of the specifications that we promote as Ghent Workgroup is called 2015, and those 2015 specifications come in two flavors. There is a CMYK flavor, or a traditional flavor if you want, and well, the 2015 specs are built on PDFX4. PDFX4 allows a lot of different color spaces, including color managed RGB. Those 2015 CMYK specs do not allow the use of RGB. So they are in fact very close to what we did in the past. They do allow live transparency, but they don't allow RGB. Okay? But in these 2015 specifications, you have another flavor that is called RGB plus CMYK, or CMYK plus RGB. And in those specifications, it is allowed to have RGB content for images, not for text and line art, but for images. And when we look at this from the point of view of the Ghent Workgroup, and when we look at this with a forward-looking state of mind, so what do we think would be a good specification to go forward, then those are the ones that we are convinced in the future will be the best situation in many workflows, because you have files that are still predictable, all the text will still be in CMYK and properly separated, all the artwork, line art is still properly separated, but you can leave your images in color managed RGB, which means that you can do what is called late binding. You have these images as RGB, and only when you know where that particular file is going to be printed will the RGB in those images be converted to CMYK. So when I look at this from a future point of view, what we feel makes the most sense and where we feel the industry should be going and is going, then I think what you're suggesting, having CMYK files with images in RGB, is probably the smartest thing to do. Yeah? When you ask me what is the situation today, well, the situation today is that most people will only accept CMYK files according to the 1v4 specifications of the Gantt Workgroup. There are definitely exceptions, and it would be smart to ask the other parties in your particular workflow what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. It could very well be that your printer says that you can send such files and that they know how to handle them, but at the moment it is not a specification that the Ghent Workgroup advises in most countries. There are exceptions. PDFX Ready, the organization in Switzerland, for example, has supported a very similar type of specification where you can have RGB in files for images for quite a while and with good results. So when you're in Switzerland, my answer would probably be slightly different. When you look at most of the other countries, they are a little bit more conservative and they're a little bit slower in adapting those new specifications. I can tell you that, for example, in the Netherlands, there is an initiative to, in a gradual fashion, also allow these new specifications to be used. And over time, they have the plan for those specifications to become the norm and the old 1v4 specifications to become a secondary option. So there is definitely a trend in that direction, but we're at the beginning of that trend, and I would still be very careful where I use such files in real workflows. I hope that answered your question. Let me see if I have something else. Yes, so one of the comments I got, vector graphics and line art can indeed be RGB in PDFX4. That's exactly what I was, why I gave so much detail. So when you look at PDFX4 by itself, at the ISO standards, then the only requirement that there is that color should be color managed. And that means that in a PDFX4 file, you can have CMYK, you can have RGB, but there needs to be an ICC profile associated with that RGB in some way. You can also have LAB in there. As long as it's color managed, it is accepted. Because the idea is, if you give someone a file where all the color is properly characterized, then with good color management software and a good color managed workflow, you should know how to handle that file. That's the idea behind PDFX4. The Ghent Workgroup took a more conservative approach, and when you look at this 2015 CMYK plus RGB specification, it is only for images that we allow RGB, not for text and line art. Of course, you're free to do something else, but from the Ghent Workgroup, the consensus or compromise, you might say, was that in the 2015 specs, it is only images that can be RGB. Have a look at the specification. There is something in there that is called, it's a very technical document. You can download it from our website. If you look at that, there is something called delivery methods, and the delivery method in the 2015 specifications can either be CMYK or classic, as we call it, or 2015. In that 2015 delivery method, you'll see a very complicated table with what is allowed and what is not allowed, and you'll see that it is only for images that you can use RGB in those specifications. Even though PDFX4 allows it, we take a little bit of a more conservative approach. Good. That's the content that I wanted to share with you. Let me scroll back to the very beginning of this. You have my contact information on there as well. If there would be any other questions that you come up with, either you can post them on the Ghent Workgroup website, or just send me an email and we can have a nice discussion about things. That's absolutely not a problem. If you are interested in some of the other topics that the Ghent Workgroup works on, there are a couple of things that you can do. First of all, this is not the last webinar that we do, so have a look at the list of webinars on the Ghent Workgroup website. Don't hesitate to subscribe to any of the others. They are all free. Secondly, you will find a lot of downloadable material on the Ghent Workgroup website, ranging from specifications to these to the Ghent PDF output suite, for example. Again, all of that is free, so please take advantage of it. There are application settings that can help you. Again, these things are free and can be downloaded from the website. If all of this makes you more interested or curious about the Ghent Workgroup and you want to explore how you could participate, there are a few different things that you can do. First of all, you can become a member. In some cases that is payable, in some cases it is not. Depends what type of organization you represent. But you can also, and that is important to know, you can also participate in the practical work that the subcommittees in the Ghent Workgroup are doing without being a member even. All you have to do is express an interest in that, send us an email, tell us which subcommittee you potentially want to be involved in. We'll get you some practical information about that. A lot of the discussion there is done through email, but you can also come to the meetings we have. We have 3 meetings per year. So I think my message is, if you're more interested, just get in contact and we will figure out how you can participate in the work of the Ghent Workgroup. And that's all I wanted to share. Thank you for being here with so many. If there are still any Americans on the webinar, many thanks specifically to you. It is a holiday today in the United States, so my hat off to all the Americans who chose to participate to this webinar regardless of that. I would say thank you for that. Go have fun the rest of the day, and to everyone else, have a really great rest of the day.